Hey, Sun Devils. It's week 30 of this government and economics class. The first half of class, the first 18 weeks, the first semester we spent on government principles. And the second semester we're spending on economic principles. And those are really two separate classes. And as we're rolling here in the fourth quarter, we're definitely spending most of our attention on economics. Now, there is, of course, some crossover because how the economy is doing really determines who's going to be voted in as president and how people see candidates, and it drives politics. And at the same time, the politics or who the president is or what political party is dominating in Congress can affect the economy. And the government gets involved in the economy and it regulates businesses and deals with tariffs and trade wars with other countries and puts economic sanctions on other countries. So there's definitely things that are interrelated. What we're going to do today is we're going to try to take some of the principles and concepts that we've talked about in this class and apply them to real world situations. And what of course, we're titled this Applied Economics. Um, I always try to have an essential question that kind of begs us to be able to answer it by the end of the day. And what drives markets and what drives us to be participants in markets? And that's really, again, what economics is all about. This is not a business class. Um, of course, we talk about the business cycle and why businesses make decisions, but I think the key word is decisions. Like what drives markets? What makes us buy certain things? Why do certain things trend? What can you do to increase sales? Well, these are psychological questions, right? What's motivating us here? What's the incentive? That's really the social science of economics. And so as we get into this here today, I always like to start off my lesson with a little personal story. An economic lesson I learned from, and fill in the blank, right? This week I thought I want to teach these students or remind these students of something I've talked about before, but an economic lesson I learned from buying my first car. I was graduated from high school. During high school, of course, my parents had a car I could use. Um, but there comes a time when you got to get your own car. And I wanted to get a car. But it's also kind of a catch 22 because you got to have a job to get a car. But sometimes you got to get a car. You have to have a car to go to work, right? I mean, it's kind of one of those tricky situations you find yourself in, and maybe your parents are in a position where they can help you out. My parents had a car I could use, but I wanted that freedom, you can't really move out and get your own place if you don't have a car. And honestly, it's not really about the car, it's about the girl. I want to get a girl. Can't have a girl without a car. Can't have a car without a job, but I really need a car to get a job. So you get stuck in this little rut, and sometimes that's where you find yourself. And I had graduated from high school and I wanted to get a car and get moving with my life, right? Wanted to go to college, things like that. So I got myself a job using my parents' car and saved up some money, went to a dealership and asked them if I could get a car. The car was cheap, right? I'm not going to be like a college student, so this is not a fancy car, a little two-door econo car. Um, so I went in, found a car I liked, sat down with the person, hey, what do I need to do to get this car? And I said, hey, I've saved up like $3,000. And he's like, that's awesome. But we have to run your credit in order to see if you can qualify for a loan for the other, what, 2 or 3 thousand, because it was like a $5,000, $6,000 car. So he ran my credit and he says, here's the bad news, dude. You don't have any credit. I'm like, yeah, isn't that awesome? I mean, I've never been in debt to anybody. And he's like, well, that is good that you're not in debt to anybody, but you have to have a credit record. You don't have any credit score. And I was like, well, what do I do to get a credit score? He's like, well, you've got to get a bill in your name. You've got to set up an account, with your social security number on it. Any kind of utilities. Have you ever taken out a loan with anything, And I was like, no. So he was kind of telling me I was, well, as the expression goes, up a creek without a paddle, right? I didn't have a credit score. I didn't even know really what credit scores were. So I kind of walked out bummed, and he said, well, if you want to buy a car, maybe your parents can co-sign on a loan. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that before, but if you have somebody who co-signs on it, it's somebody who has a good credit score who will take the financial responsibility. That means if you fall short, the bank isn't out any money because somebody who has a good credit score is backing it financially. So yes, hey, can your parents do it? Do you have a relative that can do it? And at that particular point in my life, there was nobody that I knew that I could get a loan with. And so I kind of walked home kind of bummed. And, I came back the next day and I was like, hey, I called everybody I could think of and nobody's willing to co-sign on the loan. And the guy at the store said, well, I'm sorry, dude, we can't do anything about it. And as I was walking out, funny little story, my ninth grade math teacher was there in the dealership. And he's like, hey, I remember you in my ninth grade math class. And I was like, hey, what's up? And I started talking to my old school teacher, and he's like, what are you doing here? And I was like, well, I wanted to buy my first car, but I don't have any credit score. I mean, I'm good for it. I work hard. I've got a job. And the guy was like, you know what? It's my son that owns this place. That's why I'm here. I like to help him out and do some accounting stuff. He's like, let me see what I can do. And so this guy went out of his way. He was one of my old teachers. He went out of his way to write me a letter of recommendation to the local bank. He said, I can vouch for this guy. He's got a good reputation. And he filed that with the bank. And that's how I got my first loan. So you never know when you might call on one of your teachers to help you out later in life. That's a true story. My ninth grade math teacher helped me get my first car. And of course, I paid off the loan right away. I had saved up a large chunk of money to put down as a down payment, so that helped. Um, so you never know. Don't burn bridges. You never know who's going to help you in life. That's one economic lesson. They say it's not really what you know, but who you know. And that's very true. Sometimes going to college, you don't learn that much in your college classes, but you meet people and make connections and you network, right? And it's those people you end up roommating with in college, you end up starting a business together, or you know they discover something economically that can benefit you later in life, those kind of things. But I bought in lots of cars since then, and one thing I can tell you is the higher your credit score is, the less you pay in interest, which ultimately means the less you pay overall. So hopefully this is beneficial and helpful to you. Of course, credit scores go from 300s all the way up into the mid 800s. There's really not a credit score that goes over 850. I don't know if it's possible to hit 850, but it is possible to get into the 800s. You have to have utilities in your name. You have to have bills in your name. You have to have credit cards, and use those credit cards wisely, right? And you have to take out small loans and pay them back. Those are the kind of things that will help build your credit scores. Payments made on time. Um, have open active accounts in good standing. Diversify your credit accounts, pay your bills on time, reduce your debt balance, and get rid of negative information on your report. You can challenge things to get on your report. If you're up in the 800s, you can get a loan on anything. Honestly, go to any bank, you can get a loan on any car, any house, any bank you want. If you're up in the 700s, there's a great likelihood that you'll be able to get the loan that you want at a reasonable interest rate. If you're down in the 600s, you might be able to get the loan, but you're going to pay a premium, a high price on the interest rates. And this is, after you say you hit bankruptcy or those kind of things, would be in the very low, poor category. So hopefully that's a little common sense that will help you out in life. Here are some really important information that every student in an economics class needs to know. The economic system of capitalism. So what is capitalism? I don't know if you remember the story that I told you back a little while ago about my brother, who was the ultimate capitalist. He was the candy man at our local elementary school. Capitalism came naturally to him. Nobody taught him the principles of capitalism. He just understood that if he had money and he invested that money, then he could make a profit. And then if he took that profit and reinvested it, he could continue and form a business. Now, this is back in elementary school, so he might not have been using the proper vocabulary or terminology. But again, if he bought a bag of candy for $3, and he sold each piece of candy for a quarter, and kids always have a quarter on them. It doesn't take too much math to figure out that he has to sell, 12 pieces of candy to make back the money he invested in the first place, right? Now, everything after the first 12 pieces, that would be profit. He's got to recoup the investment he already made. So if he sells another 12 pieces, then he can keep the business going. So not only did he have to sell 12 pieces, but he had to sell another 12 pieces if he wants to keep the rotation going, if that makes sense, in order to reinvest in another bag of candy. Now, these are just common sense things that my brother is thinking of. Again, he didn't have somebody sit down and teach him this in an economics class. Now, if he sells more than those 24 pieces of candy now, everything after that's going to be just, keep it profit. And of course, selling candy is low risk because if nobody buys the candy, hey, you got a bag of candy, right? So what's the risk on the investment? How much do you have to invest? How much is your profit margin? I mean, those are fancy words, but if you just think of my brother, the candy man, you can get most of the basic principles of economics right there. So capitalism is an economic idea based on the ownership of private property and competition in the marketplace. There was a dude back in the 1700s named Adam Smith who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And 1776, good year for Americans, right? That's when we started our Declaration of Independence. And that's when Adam Smith was writing this book on the wealth of nations and kind of laying out the basic fundamentals of capitalism. And Adam Smith said that who runs the economy? Who decides what should be made? Nobody does. It's the buyers and sellers. It's the supply and demand. It's the consumers and the producers. There's nobody running the show. In fact, the less the government is involved, the better off it will be because people will see a need and fill that need. He called it the invisible hand. Nobody's actually running it. It's that whole concept of supply and demand. People invest in a business. That's the venture, right? In an effort to capitalize on the growth of an industry, right? They're looking at supply and demand. Hey, there's a demand for this, but there's nobody supplying it. Or there is somebody supplying it, but I think we could do it better and cheaper, right? That's the competition that drives the price down, helps the consumer, and theoretically makes better products because people are competing for that piece of the market. Capitalism started to change economies around the world by allowing investors to become incredibly rich. And the richer they are, then the more capital they have, right? The more extra they have, right? The problem with capitalism is some people put profit over people, right? So sometimes business owners will cut corners, have unsafe practices. So that's where some people will say government is necessary to step in and make sure there are some regulations. That's why when you sell a car, there's safety regulations. Would companies put all these safety regulations and would companies have environmentally friendly emissions if the government didn't force them to? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, there's arguments that could be go both ways. But most people feel like there needs to be a little bit of check on capitalism, or else greed kind of takes over, right? Um, One thing is that true capitalists want to pay their workers less. The less you pay your workers, the more profit you get to keep. However, there is some argument that if you compensate your workers fairly and they like where they work, they'll be more productive and have loyalty to your company. So paying your workers less doesn't always equal benefits to you. Unfortunately, this can also get scary if it's unchecked. I mean, if you don't pay your workers anything, will they actually work? Yes, it's called slavery. Well, that's something that happened in ancient times, Mr. Moore. There's no such thing as slavery anymore. Really? Have you ever Googled human trafficking? Have you ever Googled child sweatshop workers or child labor in other countries? I mean, I don't know. I think that there is still kind of a form of slavery that might be more abundant than you might think going on in the world. So even that, there is an argument even in our own country about federal minimum wage. In California, there's a high minimum wage and it's supposed to go up over the next couple of years, 14, 15, etc. Per hour. And a lot of people are like, that's awesome. Then people can afford to live. The problem is if you keep increasing minimum wage, companies might hire less people because they have less cash flow. Or if the minimum wage keeps going up, the company might have to charge more per burger or per pair of shoes or um, per whatever that, haircut. Whatever the company is doing, they're going to have to charge more because they have to pay their workers more. And thus that drives up the price of everything. So that hits inflation and it causes an increase in prices across the board. Now, theoretically, capitalism also produces mass production where the supply of things goes up and it makes it more affordable. Cost goes down because more things are being produced. And that's a general terminology in economics. The more of something, the less value each piece of that something holds, right? Overall, all things being held equal, if there's more of something, the cost goes down. If there's less of something, the cost goes up. Okay. We live today in a consumer economy. There's a lot of luxury goods, buying and selling of stuff we don't even need. We're way beyond subsistence. It used to be back in caveman days or early civilizations where countries and kingdoms and empires and people in general worried about having enough to eat. Starvation was a real problem. Um, but in today's world, it seems like the exact opposite. It's not starvation, it's overconsumption. People are dying of heart attacks and heart disease because we have a gluttonous, you know, system where we're buying things we don't even need. That's what's driving a lot of business today is advertisement. Some of the biggest companies in the world make their revenue, their profit off of advertisements. How does Google make its money? It's advertisement. How is Facebook making its money? Theoretically, Facebook started off, having friends and sharing pictures with each other. So how is that a business? Because none of you guys are paying for Facebook. It's free, right? Well, it all comes down to advertising. Advertisement dominates. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. We are constantly having things shoved in our face where companies are trying to get us to buy stuff we don't need, way beyond subsistence. And that creates this system that we live in today, this consumerism, and it gets out of control. And there are some people who want to be minimalist, doing less, having less waste. So here's a couple of thoughts here. What is the invisible hand? Profit seeking producers will make more. See, because they want to make more money, so they're going to produce more. The needs of society are met because somebody sees a need and they fill it, and that creates a business. The government doesn't get involved. Now, some people will say, well, the invisible hand's good, but without the invisible hand, greed might take over, slavery might reign. Maybe the government does need to get involved a little bit, but the less the government's involved, capitalists believe that's better. Okay, there are centrally planned economies, but they have their own issues too. Competition keeps quality high. Like, why would I go back and buy a product from this person if I know that product sucks? So that keeps people in check, and competition keeps prices low. Competition and self-interest act as an invisible hand that regulates the free market, right? And of course, I already told you about this. Adam Smith was a Scottish economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations, and he talked about laissez-faire. That's hands-off economy, right? I believe in the principles of capitalism, especially in grades. So I like to be hands off on student grades. I tell my students I don't give grades in class. I just record what students do. So students have complete ability to change their grade as they want it. They work harder, they get better grades. I really try to set up my class really on that laissez-faire, hands off. I don't get involved a lot. A centrally planned, like if I was a communist teacher, everybody would get a C, right? No matter how much work you do. Well, why would anybody do any work, right? That's one of the problems with a centrally planned economy, a socialistic, communistic system. If we really spread the wealth out, okay, if the teacher forces people to spread the wealth out, then we lose that motivation. There's no motivation. If everybody's going to get a C, then what's the motivation of doing anything or learning anything? I've even talked to some of my classes before. I'm like, I have some students that have over 100% in class. I mean, if you get a 97%, that's an A plus. So all the extra points above a 97, no matter how high it goes, are kind of wasted points. I mean, you don't need them. So, and I at the same time, I always seem to have at least one or two students who's failing class. So what I've told my students, why don't we just take some of the points that the top students have and give it to the students who are failing so that nobody fails. Doesn't that sound nice? No child left behind. Nobody's going to fail my class. The problem is the kids who have an F think that's a great idea. Woohoo! The kids that have an A plus say, no way. I worked my butt off for that grade. And I did extra credit. And I studied for my test. And I know what this kid's doing. He's not doing jack squat. And sometimes when we think about grades, we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But if we apply that to money and politics, government, it can create some really interesting conversation because somebody could say, well, Mr. Moore, you're fair in your grading. Your system's fair, but Mr. So and so, his class is impossible. Nobody has higher than a B. It's impossible to get an A in his class. So the system's broken. And Mrs. So and so, everybody has a C or better. Nobody fails, no matter what you do. Even if you don't ever show up to class, you get nothing less than a C. So the system's not fair. So that it's not fair, Mr. Moore. So again, that's a conversation that people have. Students seem to understand grades more than they do money, but you kind of get the idea. Let's review some important economic terms like monopolies. What's a monopoly? It's a great game to play with your friends, especially if you have like 6 hours to kill. But I'm not talking about the game, but I kind of am. The game Monopoly, it revolves around the concept of what a monopoly really is. When one person or one business or corporation controls everything in one market. Examples from the past might be like a utility company. If there's only one company in town that runs phone lines, and if you want a phone, you've got to go through that phone company, then you don't have a choice. They charge whatever they want. Or if there's only one company in town that runs gas lines to people's house, or only one company controls the water in an area. So sometimes the government has to step in and create competition, or these companies become too powerful. In the past, I don't know, people like Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, or Andrew Carnegie, some of these guys, or J.P. Morgan, they would have been seen as monopolies or monopolists, guys who were one-man shows who controlled the steel industry or the oil industry, and there was no competition, and thus they controlled the entire marketplace. And they paid their workers jack squat because they could. And if these workers didn't want to come to work for jack squat, they would just hire somebody else who was out of work. Okay, so today maybe Google is a monopoly because if you're going to search something on the internet, where else are you going to go? So sometimes governments will step in and sue companies like Google. They'll create these antitrust laws. The government will sometimes require very large, powerful companies to be split into smaller ones to help maintain a competitive marketplace. And the government intervention in the economy to protect the consumers and end the monopoly. It's really to protect the consumers. So there's been some talk about maybe Google's getting too big, maybe Google's acquired too much, or maybe Facebook's not fair. Facebook is preventing another Facebook from being created because they control so much of the marketplace, right? Is there an alternative to YouTube? And you're like, oh, well, what about this? What about TikTok? Well, what about, there's a variety of other online video platforms, but are they as well known as Google? Like in my mind right now, I'm thinking, can I name one that might be as, no, I can't. So those are the kind of things that we we talk about as an economist to keep an economy healthy and growing and vibrant. Sometimes companies will create what they call predatory pricing. Walmart or Amazon, some of these big companies will do this. They'll actually take a loss. They'll purposely lose money to drive a competitor out of business. So maybe Walmart or Amazon would want to sue me because I'm defacing their companies. I'm just using these as examples where, let's say, there's a big company that can afford to take losses for a little while, and they drop their prices so low that they're actually losing money every time they sell something. But they know their prices are so low that everybody's going to come to them, and pretty soon that mom and pop shop is going to close down, and because they can't compete, they can't afford to take the losses this big company will. And then over a time, that mom and pop shop will close down, and then that big box chain store will start to slowly raise their price to where they're making money again, and there's no competition because they've driven the competition out. That's predatory pricing. um, and it's interesting because the more a company diversifies itself, the lower it can offer rates. Okay. So these are some of the things that we have to keep in mind: advertising, business monopolies. We talked about stock markets before, especially in past notes. And we even talked about the complexity of multinational corporations. And imagine how complicated that is to follow different rules in different states. Laws, I should say laws instead of rules, but also following the laws of different countries. And yet it's one big conglomerate, multinational corporation. So those are some of the things to keep in mind. The other thing, of course, I think we got to deal with is labor and wages and productivity. How do you get productivity? There's really two alternatives. You're either incentives or there's punishments, right? There's sticks or carrots, and that's the old adage. If you have a donkey, you can either hit it with a stick to motivate it, or you can entice it with a carrot. And again, I think I've said this maybe every time that I've lectured on economics, but people respond to incentives in predictable ways. And so that's what companies are trying to look for. As you go out in the marketplace, if you're unskilled, meaning you have no special training, you'll always be working for jack squat. The less skills you have, the lower income you'll have. You don't have to go to college to be successful, but you have to have a skill, and you've got to master that skill, and you've got to be able to demonstrate mastery of it, because the less skilled you are, the more unemployed you'll be, and the less money you'll make. I have a brother who didn't go to a single day of college. In fact, he didn't even graduate from high school. He got himself a GED after high school. Then he went and got some training, some skilled labor, and now probably makes more money than I do, even though I have a master's degree. So it's not necessarily a degree that will get you money, it's a skill. So sometimes getting a degree will get you a skill, but it's really about skill. If you want to, professional labor is interesting because there's a lot of money to be made with people that have advanced skills or advanced education. Those are the people that get high income. And again, the word skill is used both times here. This can also cause countries to import and export workers. That sounds like a slave trade, and I'm not talking about modern day slavery in this case. I'm talking about the fact that in the United States, there's a demand for highly skilled computer workers, but as a country, we're not producing enough people to fill that demand. So we have a shortage. So we're hiring people from other countries, especially places like India. They're happy to move to the United States and make higher wages. And they don't mind going to school longer hours and working weekends because they see the benefit. And so our country, in some cases, imports a lot of workers, right? It's easy to get into the United States if you have a highly skilled job. That also can sometimes create a brain drain on certain countries. Those can be really interesting things to talk about in economics. Sometimes there's a glass ceiling, an unofficial, invisible barrier in some workplaces that prevents women or minorities or anyone from advancing in certain companies. This glass ceiling, like you just can't crack it. And that's something that sometimes the government does have to step in and intervene. Empowering workers. What empowers the workers? The bosses are always trying to pay the absolute lowest, There are some companies, though, that go against that basic principle and treat their employees really good, and so they get that loyalty. Sometimes workers will form unions so that a ton of workers together can push for better wages. Teachers in California are part of unions. You can opt out of the union, but you still have to pay the union fees to a charitable donation in most districts. So there's teacher unions, there's grocery worker unions, there's steel worker unions. There's a lot of unions so that workers look out for each other. Sometimes they'll have strikes where they'll refuse to work until their wages are increased or until they're compensated fairly. Sometimes they have to go into arbitration. Somebody moderates a discussion between um, or mediation is another word that's sometimes used. Um, Trying to mediate a discussion. The boss says we can't afford to pay more, and we pull the books and we say, well, maybe you can. I mean, you're making $500,000 a year, and your workers are making $12,000. $12,000 per year, and you're making 500,000. Maybe you could cut back a little bit, and you could give them more. So there's collective bargaining. I mean, those are some of the things that workers and laborers push to get a better chance. Again, one of the most fundamental pieces of an economics class is learning to understand data and interpret charts. And probably the most iconic and famous is the supply and the demand chart. Okay? That is, if the price is too high and the quantity is too low, you could end up with your surplus. Okay? So if the price is too high and the demand is too low, that's the surplus. If the demand is high and the price is low, you might end up with a shortage of good. And we're always trying to find that equilibrium, that place where we're producing enough, but there's enough demand for it, and the price has been adjusted by that invisible hand to where a company's making profit and consumers are happy. So, how do banks and markets function? What's the relationship, and how do you go about? I would hope as a senior, all of you have a debit card, a checking account. I hope you even have a savings account. By the time you turn 18, I think you need to get a credit card, even if it's you get on one of your parents' credit cards. If you don't have a parent that will help you, maybe a grandpa or grandma or an uncle or aunt, will help you get on your feet financially to increase your credit scores and to get yourself into that. Getting bank accounts um, and starting to play your role in the greater economy. How is the American government involved in the economy? Well, I hope you've been hearing about this the entire time, right? Um, this is some funny political cartoons. Who takes the brunt of the economy? uh, you know um, this fancy word right here, Keynesian, is the idea that if the government stimulates the economy, there'll be this trickle down effect in a way where if there's money moving around, eventually it's going to end up in your pocket. Because let's say I work at a movie theater. Well, if the movie theater is shut down and nobody can go to movies, then I'm not getting paid. I lose my job, and that means I don't have money to go spend at the restaurant, or I don't have money to buy a car. And if enough of us are hit like that, then the restaurants are going to be affected. And if they're not making money, they're going to start laying people off, and then those people won't be able to go get haircuts because they don't have money. So every job is interconnected, and so that's why sometimes governments feel like they need to get involved and stimulate the economy. Right? Types of government in democracy: capitalistic, free market, right? Free enterprise to own and operate and profit from their own business. In a communist controlled center or system, you know, communism is a command economy, right? The government controls economic decisions. Who's going to work in this and how much of this is going to be produced, right? And then there's a socialistic system where you got a market economy and a command economy. Government owns the basis of business transportation and communication while allowing people to own some of their own businesses. Uh, it's interesting because we're getting now into politics as well, and that's why there is a crossover between those. Okay, I can't tell you which one's right or wrong. Only I can tell you which one is right or left on a political spectrum. How has the American government been involved in the economy in the past? Whew. I mean, that's a whole class, right? I mean, that's your U.S. history class. That's your maybe your world history class as a sophomore. In unemployment, how do you tell the health of a nation's economy? Well, unemployment gives us a good idea, right? That's one of the indicators. If a lot of people don't have jobs, we know that money isn't moving, and you can see the interconnectedness of this, right? Um, Governments are making money, and so they're paying taxes, right? And then the government can pay for services and give payments to businesses. The government contracts with private businesses, and those people, live in households and they're getting incomes and goods. So these things are going in both directions. And if we cut one of those lines, it cuts off the flow, and we get problems. Okay. There are 4 steps of mass production when we're producing things as a country. Raw materials. If a country doesn't have raw materials, it's hard to have a business because that's the ground root. You have to find a source of raw materials. That's led to wars and conflicts over times, and it still causes problems. Who has the rights to the materials, the raw materials? Manufacturing raw goods are brought into factories, and they're processed into finished products, right? That's the system that we live in today. All of that shuts down if there's not shipping. So if you want to make money, you can find the chink. Is it better to own the materials, or is it better to be the one who makes the materials? Or what if you don't make anything, but you just ship the stuff, right? I mean, that's still one of the most important things. You have products, you have to get it to a marketplace. And of course, that's the last one. The buying and selling, the prices are controlled by the supply and demand of things. These are the basic steps of capitalism and mass production and how our system really works today. Learning goal 12. Students will understand that interest rates, adjusted for inflation, rise and fall to balance the amount saved by the amount borrowed, thus affecting the allocation of scarce resources between present and future uses. There's always some great review videos. I highly recommend the Crash Course Economics. I also really find a lot of value in the Vox videos. I think they do some great investigative or researching news topics instead of just hitting highlights. Okay. Again, people can vary on their political ideologies, but there's some great, CNBC has some great videos on the economy. Is Google a monopoly? Why is Macau so rich? And of course, there is a series called We the Economy that I have posted at the end of each of my notes, put together to teach basic economic principles. Thank you for joining me on week 30, Applied Economics. We'll see you next week.